Hello, this is a talk about Tamara de Lempicka, the Art Deco high society portrait painter of the aristocracy during the 1920s and 1930s. Let's look at her early life first, though. This is her mother. She was born Tamara Rosalia Gerwig-Gorski in 1894 in Warsaw, Poland, which was then under Russian rule. Her father was a Russian Jewish lawyer who worked for a French trading company, and her mother, shown here on the left, is Malwina Dekla, who was a Polish Jewish socialite, a wealthy family. So, for example, they sent her to finishing school. They spent the season in St. Petersburg. They took vacations in Carlsberg and Marienbad. They gambled in Monte Carlo and so on. From the beginning, Tamara, shown here on the right, age 13, was willful and domineering. As an example, when she was 12, her mother arranged for her portrait to be painted, her younger sister's portrait to be painted, and Tamara looked at it, and because she was so unhappy with the result, she got the pastels and drew the portrait of her sister herself, which she claimed was a lot better than that of the prominent local artist. When she was 17, she went to boarding school in Switzerland, but was bored. So her grandmother took her on a tour of Italy, where she developed an interest in art. The following year, her parents divorced, and she went to live with her aunt in St. Petersburg. And there she fell in love with a prominent Polish lawyer called Tadeusz Wempicki, and they married in 1916. Now, she was a high society woman in St. Petersburg. Incidentally, it was then called Petrograd. And she lived a life of what at the time they called a hot little potato. That is, like many society women, she engaged in many affairs, and in her case, with both men and women. This is her husband. In English, his name is Thaddeus Lempicki, and her name in Polish is more like Lempicka, but I'll use the English form, Lempicka, Tamara de Lempicka. Now, it was the beginning of the Russian Revolution, and her husband was arrested in the middle of the night by the secret police following a takeover by the Bolsheviks. But with the help of the Swedish consul, she managed to secure his release, and they fled to Copenhagen, then London, and finally Paris, where the rest of her family had found refuge. And the following year, she gave birth to a daughter, Kizette. So they lived in Paris for many years, but her husband was unable or was not willing to find work, and they lived on her dowry and then started selling the family jewels. So following the birth of their daughter, she decided she needed to make money, and her sister suggested she become a painter. She studied at the St. Petersburg Academy of Arts and an academy in Paris with Maurice Denis and then with André Lot. And Lot became a great influence on her work. I'll show you an example of his work later. Now, when she started training, she was at first a bit reluctant, a bit unsure about whether she really wanted to become an artist, but she soon made up her mind, and she then worked assiduously and almost immediately produced surprisingly mature paintings like this still life. She moved to Montparnasse, and she worked 3 sessions a day at the academy, morning, afternoon and evening, and she still found time to prepare her husband's meals before the beginning of the day. And between the afternoon and the evening sessions, she mixed with famous artists and the fashionable high society at cafes in Paris. She always dressed in the height of fashion. As she couldn't afford to buy the latest fashion, she would sew a fashionable dress in the afternoon or evening, and at night she would paint, sometimes till 6 a.m. A very hard worker. Now, as I said, her first paintings were still lifes, some portraits, and she started to sell at the Galerie Colette Weil and then exhibited at the Salon de Indépendant, the Salon d'Automne, the Salon de Moins de 30 ans, and she signed her paintings at this point Lempicka, which is the masculine form of her name. And she sold all her paintings and started to live a better life. She engaged in a non-stop stream of parties with famous artists and writers, dukes and counts. She mixed with all the leading artists in Paris. She knew Pablo Picasso, Marc Chagall, Kees van Dongen. She ate at Maxime's and the Ritz and started to buy clothes from her friends Coco Chanel and the Italian designer Elsa Schiaparelli. She bought a yellow Renault. She took on a small studio and opened a bank account. In fact, the bank were so concerned by all the money flooding into her account, they visited her to find out if it was legal. And at first she didn't understand why they'd come. But soon she realised, showed her the banker her paintings, and in fact he bought one for 50,000 francs. She became the centre of the artistic life of Paris, and she knew all of the artists in Paris. And at that time, Paris was the centre of the artistic world. As an example, at one time she was sitting next to the Italian futurist E.T. Marinetti, and he suddenly jumped on the table and made his famous speech about burning down the Louvre, and she offered to drive him there. They went outside to get in the car, but found the police had impounded it for illegal parking. So they walked sheepishly to the police station. She got her car back, but everybody wandered off into the night. The burning of the Louvre had been averted. It was the beginning of Art Deco, and Lempicka was there at the right time with the right style and the right approach. Now, Art Deco was primarily a French movement that conveyed modernity and glamour, with bold geometric patterns, sleek lines, rich colours, and the subject matter was luxurious, decadent and sensual, with hard edges, metal and flesh, modern buildings, automobiles, and the naked body. This is Group of Four Nudes. She painted in 1925, the year of the first Art Deco exposition in Paris, which in fact gave the name to the movement Art Deco. And although Lempicka didn't exhibit at the exhibition, she was already painting in this style. By the way, I said I'd show you an example. This is an example painted by her mentor, André Lotte. And I wanted to show it to you to show the influence of his work on her and also the differences. Lotte looks classical, but Lempicka looks lively, modern, daring. So Art Deco took off as a symbol of the Roaring Twenties and the Jazz Age. And here's an example. She painted portraits of her friends, the rich and the famous. This is the Duchess de la Salle, one of her most famous works. And these portraits established her in the higher echelons of European society, because she captured, or perhaps created, this poise and sophistication shown here in the portrait of the Duchess. It combined modern femininity, wealth and style. And portraits like this caught the excitement of the time, and she became better known. She was in great demand by the rich and the famous from all over Europe. They wanted to be portrayed like this as leaders of this new style. Lempicka also frequently used her daughter Cosette as a model. This is portrait of Cosette. But Lempicka's art would always come first. She was first an artist, second a mother. She would take Cosette with her in the evening, but I think that was to counterbalance her glamour and elegance, and it provided an easy way for men to approach her and for her to approach men. They would flatter Cosette and give her presents as a way to introduce themselves to Lempicka. She brought Cosette up strictly and later sent her to boarding school. Incidentally, a lot of the biographic information I'll be providing is from Cosette herself in her book Passion by Design, The Art and Times of Tamara de Lempicka. Another portrait of Cosette. Lempicka was still continuing to learn her craft at this stage from Maurice Denis and André Lotte. Denis taught her draftsmanship, Lotte various painting techniques and a love of Ingres, one of her favourite painters. She was always a domineering presence in any gathering, and as I said, put her art first. So her mother and daughter spent a difficult half-century together. One more, I thought I'd show you one more portrait. This is The Sleeping Girl, which is Cosette. It's a well-known later portrait of Cosette sleeping. In fact, because Lempicka dominated everyone, Cosette felt empty without her, and for the last 20 years of her mother's life, she had to cater to the whims of a proud but publicly ignored grande dame. As I said, Lempicka was immediately accepted by high society. She was seen to be one of them, and she remained so during the Roaring Twenties and the Jazz Age, known in Paris as the Crazy Years. This is the Marquis Sommi. He was an Italian aristocrat, patron of the arts, and a friend and lover of Lempicka. And he probably commissioned this to reflect his status and his wealth and his social importance, which Lempicka was able to convey by combining glamour with the modernity of her subjects. Many of the aristocrats and the rich of Europe had actually lost their estates and a large part of their wealth during World War I, and further, inflation in France after the war depleted their resources. So they played life on the surface. They lacked any real power, and they pushed pleasure with abandon, and Lempicka could make them look sophisticated while doing it. Politically, many were right-wing. They admired Mussolini, they toyed with fascism, and she captured exactly the mood, that flash of arrogance, and she could do it as she was one of them and knew how they felt. She knew them, both men and women, intimately, and it was her feeling for her subjects that separated her from many of the other Art Deco painters at the time. In 1926, the poet, playwright, soldier and aristocrat Gabriele D'Annunzio invited her to paint his portrait, and at this time he was a legend. He was the leading literary figure in Europe, known for his decadence and sensuality. As a political figure, he was a national hero in Italy. And he influenced the rise of fascism in Italy. And so his reputation is still the subject of debate. This is a photograph I took inside his mansion, Il Vittoriale in Gardonian on Lake Garda. This is a view of part of his estate, which is a large estate He has an enormous mausoleum there, a complete amphitheatre, an aeroplane, a sunken garden, and even a ship that he had lifted up from the bay into his garden. Now, his intention seems to have been to ask Lempicka to paint his portrait in order to seduce her. And her intention was simply to paint his portrait. So after rejecting his advances for several days, she fled the mansion and never completed the portrait. So I can't show you a portrait, it was never finished. However, although she didn't paint his portrait, she felt she'd arrived as an artist, as he'd met and talked to her on equal terms. She had spoken to and got to know the most famous man of letters in Europe. Now, as I said, she was bisexual, had affairs with both men and women, and they were conducted in ways that was considered scandalous at the time, but they did increase her reputation in high society, where such outrageous sexual behaviour was a way of life. In the 1920s, she became closely associated with lesbian and bisexual women in writing and artistic circles. For example, the British writer and artist Violet Trefusis, the English writer Vita Sackville-West, and the singer Susie Solidar, whose portrait we'll see later. Now, this model is Raffaella, a muse and lover of Lempicka, who she first met on the Bois de Boulogne. We don't know her full name, as Lempicka kept the identity of her muses secret and shrouded in mystery. Now, Lempicka believed she stood out amongst artists as, she said, the first woman who did clear painting, and that was the success of my painting. Among 100 paintings, you could recognise mine, and the galleries began to put me in the best rooms, always in the centre, because my painting attracted people. It was neat, it was finished. And this is an example, the pink tunic. In 2019, it sold for $13.4 million, making it the most expensive painting by a Polish artist ever sold. This is another painting of Raffaella, La Belle Raffaella, and Lempicka described her as the most beautiful woman she'd ever seen. Huge black eyes, sensuous mouth, and a beautiful body. In fact, when she saw her on the Bois de Boulogne, she said to her, "Mademoiselle, I am a painter and would like you to pose for me. Would you do this?" She said, "Yes, why not?" And that's how they got to know each other. The pose and treatment here recalls the classical tradition of the reclining nude by artists like Ingres and Titian, but Lempicka, with her dramatic lighting and sensual atmosphere, has added a modern Art Deco twist. It's been described, this painting, as, quote, among the most potently erotic works of Lempicka, in which the desire of the artist for the soft and curvaceous body of the model is palpable. This is a portrait of her husband. You might think it represents true love, but there's a different story behind it. Now, in 1928, she'd become the most sought-after portrait artist in Europe. For each portrait, she charged around 50,000 francs, which was about $2,000, and each one took her about 3 weeks. So she made a lot of money. She spent the money on hats, clothes, jewellery, parties, and she was a star, like Greta Garbo. In fact, she looked like Garbo. This is Lempicka, and this is a picture of Greta Garbo. People mistook her for Greta Garbo. In fact, on one occasion, She was staying in a hotel and people gathered outside thinking it was Greta Garbo. And as a favour to the hotel, she went out and signed her autograph as Greta Garbo. Now, her husband complained that she only talked about herself. All her meals were with art critics and rich patrons, and she spent all her money on herself. So in compensation, she offered to paint this portrait of him, which was the only way she knew to show how much she loved him. But before finishing the painting, he travelled to Warsaw on business. And while he was there, he went to the dentist. And on the stairs, he bumped into a woman who he'd never met. But by the time they'd walked down the stairs, she expressed her love for him, literally love at first sight. They had an affair and he left Tamara, but she travelled 3 times to Warsaw and eventually convinced him to stay with her and suggested they go to Monte Carlo to try and patch things up. But it, as you might expect, it didn't work. They had the worst row they'd ever had in front of Gazette. And she admitted to all the numerous affairs she'd had. He accused her of affairs she never even had, which she admitted to. And she in turn accused him of being a failure and a fool. He stormed out to marry the woman he'd met. She expressed her rage in the only way she knew how. She refused to finish the painting. Now, look at his left hand. She always painted in the same way. She would put on the underpaint and she would first paint the face, then the hands, then one arm and then the other, and then one leg and then the other leg, and then finally the background. And you'll see, looking at his left hand, that she skipped to the left hand. She didn't finish the left hand, and she omitted the wedding ring. And she called it not Portrait of her husband, but Portrait of a Man. And she finished it in 1928, the year they were divorced. And that year, she met this man, Baron Raoul Kufner. He was the owner of the largest estate in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And in fact, he'd been buying all her paintings, all the paintings he could get his hands on for the previous 5 years. And he suggested that she paint his mistress. Now, his mistress was Nana de Herrera, the famous Andalusian dancer. And when she arrived at the studio, Lempicka found her badly dressed and not at all chic or elegant, and she didn't know what to do. She tried her in all sorts of different poses, and in the end she just asked her to undress. She took all her clothes off and draped some lace over her, and then asked her to pose as if she was dancing. And Lempicka felt that that was the best she could do, and this is the resulting painting. Before long, the elegant and sophisticated Lempicka had replaced Herrera as the Baron's mistress. She continued to paint many people. This is Dr. Bouchard. He was a scientist who made millions from his patent for a medicine called Lacteol. I think it still sells, actually, for digestive problems. And he invited her to spend a year working on portraits of him, his wife, and his daughter. And to do that, she drove a hard bargain and made enough money to live the way she wanted from the assignment. She bought a large apartment in a smart area of Paris, had the best architects and designers decorated in a theatrical Art Deco style, so that the apartment became a backdrop for her and her elegant parties. Now, the Bouchards were a very wealthy Parisian family, the elite of Paris. He is shown holding a test tube and with his other hand a microscope while wearing a dazzling white coat. His wife is shown wearing a white silk dress and what looks like a fur-lined red drape. And his daughter Arlette is shown. It's one of Lempicka's celebrated works, characteristic Art Deco style, bold colours, sharp lines, a stylised, glamorous depiction of the young girl. And you'll notice in the background is a boat. It's her father's yacht, a symbol of La Dolce Vita, enjoyed by the upper classes in the late 20s. This work is well known for its composition and striking colours and its reference to the Jazz Age. We don't know who the woman was, but she exemplifies the modern liberated woman of the 20s and 30s. Musical instruments were a major theme of Cubist work of the 1910s, but Lempicka has broken away from the broken planes and drab colours of Cubism. Her palette is often limited, but her colours reflect the tastes of the period, and they're always bright, strong colours. Here's an example, one of her most famous works, Auto-Portrait. This is Tamara in a green Bugatti. In fact, it's used, this painting, as the front cover of her biography, Passion by Design. It shows her at the height of her fame, and she painted originally for the cover of the German magazine Die Dame, a publication focused on fashion and lifestyle for the modern independent woman, and the commission aligned perfectly with Lempicka's image of the chic, confident and modern woman, a theme she often explored in her art and personal life. It shows her behind the wheel of a sleek green Bugatti, which was a luxury car associated with speed, style and status. In fact, she never actually owned a Bugatti. But by placing herself in the driver's seat, she emphasises control, autonomy, and the act of driving, especially for women in the 1920s, was a powerful symbol of independence. Now, one day, out of the blue, she was visited by an American, later turned out to be an American millionaire, Rufus Bush, who wanted her to paint his fiancée in New York. The deal that they arranged made it worth her while to go to New York to paint his fiancée. She earned a lot from the commission. She spent longer in New York than she intended, upsetting her daughter Cosette, as she'd promised that she would definitely be back for Christmas, but she never was. While she was there, all the money she earned in America, she put into an American bank, and that was one of the banks that went bust in the Wall Street crash. So on her return, she'd lost the money that she had earned in America. She still had the money she'd earned in France, but everything had changed. Many had lost all their money in the crash, which was followed by the Depression. She was still rich and famous, and she was now painting the kings and queens of Europe, but the mood of the time had changed. This is Adam and Eve, and let me explain how she produced or arrived at this religious work. She was painting a model in the studio nude. The model took a break, a rest break, and was so hungry she asked if she could eat an apple from a bowl of fruit that Lempicka was using for a still life. And as soon as she picked up the apple, Lempicka had an idea. She saw her as Eve and furiously sketched her standing there with the apple, but she was lacking an Adam. So, typical Lempicka, she rushed into the street, saw a handsome policeman walking by and asked him if he would model for her He agreed to model nude, and when he came to her studio after work, he removed his clothes and posed for her as Adam, as we see here. Hardly a religious inspiration, but she had the painting she wanted. Incidentally, later in life, she did start painting religious works. And this work, which was formerly owned by Barbara Streisand, sold at auction for $2 million in 1994. Now, some of her paintings, like Adam and Eve, and this representation of Andromeda, were representing particular myths and legends. Others were models and some were friends. This one is sometimes called The Slave, emphasising bondage, which was a recurring theme in her work and popular at the time. But it also is sometimes called Andromeda, which is a reference to the princess of Greek mythology who was chained to a rock to appease a sea monster and so save the kingdom's people. Before the sea monster ate her, Perseus arrived and turned the monster to stone using the head of Medusa, thus saving her life. This is the picture I said earlier I'd show you, Suzy Solidar. She was a French singer, actress and nightclub owner. She owned La Vie Parisienne. And she was regarded as so beautiful, all the artists in Paris wanted to paint her. And there are some 200 portraits. She was lesbian. She had a personal and professional relationship with Lempicka. And this sharp, angular portrait is typical of the Art Deco style. And it highlights her confident, bold persona. An androgynous allure, which was part of her public identity. In fact, as a publicity stunt, she became what she called the most painted woman in the world. And she posed for, as I said, there were some 200 portraits, but she posed for Picasso, Braque, Raoul Dufy, Francis Picabia, Kees van Dongen, and of course Lempicka. And this is the most famous of her portraits. Later in life, Solidar gave 40 of her portraits to the village she lived in. Another example, this is nude with buildings. We don't know who the woman was. It's probably a professional model. And Lempicka often painted nudes as a way to explore sensuality and the power of the modern woman. And the modernity is represented by these stylized forms in the background, inspired by the modern skyscrapers that she'd seen in New York. This is portrait of Ira Perrault, lover and muse of Lempicka, part of her social circle. We don't know much about her though, because Lempicka kept the personal details private. We see Ira leaning seductively across the picture plane, holding a bouquet of calla lilies and a billowing red shawl. Now, flowers have always had a romantic association, which may have been the intent here, but they also, in this case, complement the dress in the colour and the shape. This painting sold at Christie's in 1998 for $1.2 million. Marjorie Ferry was a British cabaret singer, and she's painted here as a polished, glamorous figure, blended with sensuality, modernity, bold geometric shapes, strong contrast between light and shadow. It was commissioned by Ferry's husband in 1932 and painted in Lempicka's studio, and it was intended as a gift to his newlywed wife. You can see his other gift to her, bright, large cabochon ring, which he gave her. It's been described by some as the Art Deco Mona Lisa, as she has similar corners to her mouth and eyes as well as the shape of her eyes and eyebrows. This is a portrait of Madame M, and we assume this title was used when it was shown at exhibitions to protect her real identity, and we now know who it is. For a long time we never knew, but research has shown it was commissioned by a senior lawyer, André Morilot. So this is Madame Morilot, and he commissioned it as a gift to his wife following their marriage in 1929. And we know Lempicka rated this picture highly as she exhibited it in her studio and at the Salon des Tuileries. 1932, when she completed this work, was an important year for her. She profited. She was still at the peak of her reputation, and there were still people with money who commissioned her to paint their portrait to show that they still had wealth even during the Depression. However, as the Depression deepened, as the 30s advanced, these lavish commissions began to become more scarce, and this, in fact, is one of the last of her big portraits. Remember Baron Kaufner? Lempicka continued her affair with him on and off, and renewed it after she returned from America. Now, in 1933, Baroness Kaufner, his wife, died, and the Baron wrote to Lempicka proposing marriage. It was a very attractive proposal. She, like him, were at the centre of her circle of friends, so they all knew the same people. He promised her money, essentially unlimited money, a title, Baroness, the freedom to continue her affairs with men and women. But despite all that, at first she refused. She wasn't playing hard to get. She genuinely wasn't sure that she wanted to marry him. She liked him, but she didn't love him. But her mother intervened, told her she was acting like a spoilt child and not getting any younger. And for once, she listened to her mother and married the Baron in 1933. By this time, 1935, 1937, the excitement had gone from the Art Deco style, and Lempicka's style and subject matter began to change. These are two paintings from the mid-1930s. And the world was changing. In 1933, Hitler became Chancellor in Germany. There were Nazi uniforms everywhere. She lived in Paris, but saw signs of revolution, which she had, of course, witnessed before in St. Petersburg, but she had to flee, and she urged the Baron to sell his estates and all of his properties and move to Switzerland with the money, but he wouldn't listen. As an example, she stopped off in Berlin on one occasion, travelling back to Paris. She just wanted to see some friends, and she didn't realise she needed a visa, which was a serious matter. She was arrested and almost sent to prison. But luckily, the head of the police, the chief's wife, loved her paintings. And so the chief of police, knowing his wife's love for her paintings, let her off with a small fine, but warned her to never come to Germany again. So back in Paris, she still held endless parties, still visited nightclubs, still dined at Maxime's, but as I said, the mood of the times had changed. The years passed. Cosette, her daughter, graduated from Oxford, but just travelled round Europe from one pleasure spot to another. Lempicka's long-time friend, Ira Ponti, stole money from her, so she severed off their relationship, which was a bitter blow for her. In 1938, Hitler overran Austria, and at last the Baron listened to her and sold many of his properties and moved his treasures to Switzerland. And in 1939, as war loomed, they decided to move to America. But before leaving Italy, she went to convalesce and tried to cure her depression. And then suddenly, on the spur of the moment, she decided to enter a convent. So she went to a convent near Parma, rang the bell, and waited to see the Mother Superior to ask if she could enter the convent. But as soon as she saw the Mother Superior, she saw the suffering of the world on her face, forgot why she'd come, and rushed out to get a canvas and brushes to paint her. But they were on the point of leaving for New York, so she had to leave for New York, and in New York she painted this painting of the Mother Superior from memory. In fact, Lempicka described how she was in a trance for 3 weeks and found herself talking to the Mother Superior as if she was there in the room. And she regarded this as her best work, although some people think it's just cheap sensationalism. And in 1936, she began to see a psychiatrist whom she painted as St. Anthony. She was nearly 40 and her beauty was beginning to fade, and she turned to religion for comfort. But in New York, she continued to hold parties. She continued to mix with all the famous artists and the rich and famous. She was written about in the press. She's shown here at an exhibition of her work talking to Salvador Dali with the Mother Superior painting behind her. The press wrote about her frequently, dubbed her the Baroness with a brush. This is a painting called Susanna Bathing, exhibited and well received by the press. And she wanted to finish another related painting called Susanna and the Elders. But she'd left the part-finished painting in Europe, so she needed a body double to finish it. And she advertised to the students of UCLA, and hundreds of women students came to pose for her nude, until finally she found the body she wanted to complete the painting. The unusual nature of the process she'd gone through, the advertising for a nude model, made the national press and further increased her fame in America. And this is Lempicka arranging the model, Cecilia Myers, for this painting. When she became involved in war relief work, donating time and money, particularly for Polish causes, and she managed to arrange for Cosette to come to America, where she enrolled in Stanford University, where she ran into an old friend from Oxford. Lempicka and the Baron applied for American citizenship, but things were changing within her. She wasn't painting as much. Her fame was declining and her subject matter changed. Gradually, the press began to write about her not as an artist, but as a society baroness who just happened to paint as a hobby. Gloria Vanderbilt said she's fun and she does these amusing paintings, possibly the worst description a serious artist could imagine. And at this time she painted a wide range of subjects, such as this one, her studio in the country. They moved to New York. They were still extremely wealthy. They bought a large apartment with a 2-story studio with northern light. And she continued to paint in the old style for a few years, but then took up abstract painting like this abstract composition in black and grey. And then by the 1960s, she was painting abstract and semi-abstract works in pastel colours and loose forms, like this work here, abstract composition in blue. She held an exhibition at the Iolas Gallery in New York in 1962, but the critics were cautious. She found few buyers. She decided never to exhibit again. As she got older, she played the grande dame and liked to tell the same stories of her life endlessly. She always wanted her own way. She'd dominate still and try to control everyone she knew. She painted not as much as she had previously, but she still continued to paint a wide range of subjects. I selected this, difficult to find a typical work of the period, but I thought this work conveyed the loneliness of a largely forgotten artist. And then, in 1972, there was a retrospective of her work at the Galerie du Luxembourg, and the exhibition was a success. She felt that she'd become appreciated again, and her work was in demand, and she came under pressure to create or recreate her great works of the past. But sadly, her hand was not as sure as it had been, and her fine colour sense had gone, and she did produce many replicas, but there's no way that they could be mistaken for the originals, and I won't show you any of them. I think she's best remembered for her finest work of the 1930s, and she died in her sleep on the 18th of March 1980. Her life reflects and her work embodies the spirit of Art Deco and the Jazz Age in the 1920s and 30s. Although she lived to 1980 and continued to paint, she's known for the work she did during that period. And she did live to see a revival of interest in her work during the 1970s, and she's now regarded as the most important artist of the Art Deco period. Thank you for your time and attention, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.